All right, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. I know some folks are still streaming in. My name is Brian Van Hook, and I'm Regional Director of the Florida Small Business Development Center at FIU Business. We want to welcome you to this webinar that's entitled Management Control, What, Why, and How. I can tell you our center has been around for about 5 years, and we've never seen as much demand, obviously due to the pandemic and other conditions, for services related to management, operations, strategy, HR. So I think that this webinar is very good content, but it's also very timely in terms of kind of the conditions and issues businesses are facing. Before I turn it over to our presenter, Ricardo Newark, I just wanted to mention for like 1 minute what our center does and how we can help you out. We are, as I mentioned, under FIU's College of Business. We work with businesses in Miami-Dade County and also the Florida Keys. If you're watching this from around the state, don't worry if you're not in Miami or the Keys. We do have other SBDCs that are in your area. So you can please follow up to Brianna, and she can get you connected to a local SBDC because they have really great consultants. They're not as charming as Ricardo always, but they basically are really great consultants around the state that can help you with your business. And our focus is on one-on-one business consulting. We want to help you grow your business. We want to help you, as we always say, work smarter, not harder. And so this webinar is kind of right on par with that. We have a great team of specialists at FIU. And as I mentioned, we do have other sister centers around the state that can help you out. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ricardo Newark, one of our really great business consultants, and he's going to provide the content. I would encourage you, please fill out the survey that Brianna is going to give you at the end of the webinar, because that ensures that we have really great content. We're covering the topics you want. And then also, if you have any questions, please put the questions in the Q&A, and Ricardo can answer them at the end of the webinar. So thanks again for participating, and look forward to kind of interacting with you during the webinar. Ricardo, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Brian. Welcome everybody to the Management Control webinar. Let me start by saying this doesn't look like a very glamorous subject until something happens. Control is something that you notice when it's not there. When it works at its best, maybe you don't know it's there. When it doesn't work, you have a big fire, a big problem, and you wonder what happened. What we'll try to do today is give you some structure, some roadmap in terms of what to do to prevent that from happening. So we'll talk about what is control, why do we need it, and how do we implement it. This is a very wide subject, so we'll be focused on some key elements. I want to tell you that the nomenclature for this subject in the bibliography that you can find might differ, but the concepts are very similar. And again, as I will touch upon as we go through, the way you exercise control differs from different industries and different situations, but the concept, again, there's the basic concept that apply in every single case. Let me start briefly with an introduction of myself. This is a brief summary of my experience. What I've been doing, I spent a long time in the corporate world and joined the SBDC at FIU at the very beginning several years ago. And I'm enjoying consulting with small and medium-sized businesses with the SBDC, and also once in a while having this kind of webinars. So, but let's try trying to define what is control. At the highest level implies measuring certain key indicators to ensure they meet standards and taking timely corrective action when they don't. A lot of substance in that brief definition. We need to measure. We need to know what the key indicators are. We need to define the information we'll use to measure them. We need to define the standards that use for comparison and what corrective actions are going to be taken if indicators don't meet the standards. So just following the logic, the whole thing here is to measure certain very important elements. So we need to know which ones are those. In order to measure, you need information. You need to define what's the information that highlights the status of that key indicator. Once you measure, you need a comparison. Am I okay? I'm not okay. So you need to set standards against which you compare the measure you just took. And then if there are deviations, you need to take corrective actions to make sure you go back to where you want to be, that is within those standards. So this is the substance of control, and this is what we're going to be following as we go through the presentation. So what's a control process? First, you need to establish standards. What are our objectives? Again, as we probably see it in many cases, having clearly defined objectives, measurable objectives, is key to the management function, and control is no different. We need to establish standards. Then we need to measure actual results. How are we actually doing versus those standards or those objectives? Then we need to compare those actual results with the standards. Are we achieving our objectives or not? Then analyze the cause of deviations. If we're failing to meet our objectives, why are we failing? And then take corrective actions. What can we change to achieve our objectives? So the concept of implementing controls is indirectly forcing the company to have written, defined goals, standards against which we can determine are we doing okay or not. It's forcing the company to measure results. You need to have effective measurements. We'll talk about that. Will depend on what you're trying to measure, but you need numbers, you need evidence of how are you doing. And once you have that, then you need to do a comparison. You need to always go back and say, now I measure how I'm doing, how that compare with my goals. I've been trying to do this. Am I getting there or not? And if we don't, why? And this is a very rich process and goes to the essence of control. Why is it that we're not meeting our goals? What's the reason for deviations? And once you complete that process, then you need to take corrective action. What can we change? What can we do to eliminate those deviations and achieve our objectives? Very rich process. You cannot skip any step in order to achieve the desired goals. Now, the first thing, as we said before, was to define what indicators we want to measure. Unfortunately or fortunately, we can't measure everything. So we need to set priorities. What are the elements critical to the business? What can be reasonably measured? And what corrective actions can the business really manage? So again, we cannot measure every single indicator in the business because they'll probably make no sense. So management needs to set priorities, need to define which are those goals that are more crucial, more relevant to achieving the key goals and priorities of the company. What is really crucial for me to know I'm getting there in order to succeed? And we're gonna go later, could this be revenue? Could this be profit? Could this sales? Could be many things that depends on the circumstance, depends on the company, depends on the industry. Then this other important consideration of what can be reasonably measured. We cannot measure without information. Getting information usually can be expensive. We cannot have information to measure everything. So that filtering process through which we set priority also applies to the consideration of the information needed. Sometimes might be something that it's quite important to know, but the cost of gathering the information might be overwhelming. And there's a trade-off to be made there, whether is it worthwhile spending the time, effort, resources to get the information to measure that particular variable or not. And once we measure, once we have the results, what corrective action can the business manage? Again, keyword here, what can we manage? Doesn't help us very much to identify corrective actions we cannot manage. This has a lot to do with the external environment to the company. The economy might not be doing well. Well, there's little you can do to manage that. We might have a coronavirus crisis. Well, there's very little you can do to manage that. There's certain things you can do at the company level. You cannot do it at the country or world level. So let's be aware of the things we can control internally. And taking again the example of the coronavirus, there are many things we can do internally to protect our business from that virus. But maybe there are little things we can do to deal with schools or gatherings or things that people do that are outside the scope of our business. So define priorities, be conscious of the cost of gathering the information, and concentrate on actions you can manage. So some examples of key areas of control. There are government regulations, their internal processes, and business performance. These are three big buckets where the usually control can be divided in. And again, as I said before, they can have different bibliography with different classifications, but this can be as helpful as any other one. Government regulations are a set of norms, processes, laws, requirements set by the government that we must fulfill. It's not an option for us. We need to live up to them. And control means we need to ensure that we're doing that. What are the variables that we can measure to make sure we're in line with government regulations? Internal processes is another very critical one. And you can talk about the disbursement of cash. You can talk about accounting. You can talk about payroll. You want to make sure those internal processes are valid, are working, and they're doing what they're supposed to do. Because otherwise, you might end up with, as I said before, some unexpected issues, unexpected problems, unexpected fires that can be very damaging to the company. And the third big bucket is business performance. I touched upon this before: revenue, profit, sales, cost. And again, depending on the circumstances and the level, you can be very broad, can be very specific. If you're looking at a factory, you might look at the number of absenteeism and turnover and energy usage. So at different levels, business performance is defined in different ways. And that's what another consideration here. Control can be exercised and should be exercised at the total company level, maybe at the function level, at different places inside the company, depending on the size of the company and the relevance of the subject. So this is the first step, define the areas of control. Let's get into them in a little more detail. Government regulation. Let me give you some examples, and there are, as you probably know, many, many more. There are some codes, civil codes, commercial codes, criminal codes that apply to the location where you do business. There are accounting and reporting standards established by the boards that, again, we don't control, but they determine how companies should report their results. Their taxes, as you know, their health and safety requirements, their environmental requirements, their labor regulations, their discrimination laws, their privacy requirements, their sexual harassment policies. So whether you think about them explicitly or not, companies need to live up to the requirements of all these government regulations. Not doing so could result very, very harmful for the company and impact your operation in a way that it's hard to foresee until you hit the problem. And that's what I was referring to at the beginning about the relevance of control. If you are doing something that is not allowed by civil, commercial, criminal code, you may end up in court. If you don't use accounting and reporting standards, you run the risk of being accused of fraud because you're reporting results that are not true. That is particularly valid for public companies. But even if it's a private company and you have shareholders, then you want to make sure that the numbers you're giving them are accurate. If you don't pay taxes, you get in trouble, and you don't want to have big tax audits and worse, big tax penalties. Health and safety, if you don't live up to them, they might come and close your operation. Environmental regulations, again, depends on the company, depends on the operation, but not living up to them, again, can result in very significant fines. Labor regulations, as you know, not complying with the many, many labor regulations in terms of hours, salaries, free days, vacations, whatever the case may be, can bring you big problem. Discrimination, you know also that you hear that's a lot in the news about companies being sued for discrimination. Privacy, if you don't respect the data that you have when it belongs to somebody else, that's another big issue. And sexual harassment, again, you can, if you don't have in place processes to control the proper application of how people are dealt with, again, you all run the risk of a sexual harassment lawsuit. So these are just examples that, depending on the company, depending on the size, depending on the industry, have more or less relevance, but all companies are impacted one way or another by regulations. Not all of them with the same importance, not all of them with the same intensity, but very critical to keep them in mind. The second bucket we talk about is what I call internal processes, or you probably heard the word compliance. So you have accounting requirements. You want to make sure that the way you account for your results is in line with the accepted accounting principles. Human resources, you need to ensure that your human resources processes, hiring, firing, payrolls, are all proper. Cash disbursement, cash is a very dangerous element to leave uncontrolled. You want to have processes in place that ensure that the way cash is disbursed in any shape or form, either in terms of salaries or paying to a supplier or any other way, is controlled. Somebody's approving it, that the approval levels are in line with the amount of the cash disbursement, and so on. Cybersecurity, very much in fashion these days. You probably heard, or some way or another, directly or indirectly, of companies that get into deep trouble because information is stolen or there's some ransomware required. So cybersecurity, and again, there's a trade-off here in terms of how much you invest to protect your security, but we need to be aware of that and make the proper trade-off. The way you purchase, the way you contract with third parties, you want to make sure that's transparent, that everything is proper, that you're not subject to somebody coming and deciding that you didn't follow the proper rules in purchasing or contracting. Again, depending on the company, whether you're private or whether you're public, the requirements are different. But in any case, you want to make sure that when you sign a contract, the contract includes everything you want included in it, and you don't want to come to the conclusion a year down the road or 2 years down the road that you forgot to include this or that clause, and therefore you run into trouble with whoever's on the other side of the contract. And then health, safety, environmental. These days with the coronavirus, this is particularly relevant. People can really get sick. People can die if the company doesn't follow the proper health, safety, and environmental considerations. And this is, again, this is an internal process. This has nothing to do with the external network of codes established by the government. This is how we internally take those regulations and apply them to make sure that we're in compliance, as the title said. So this is the second bucket, what I call internal processes. And the third bucket is what I call business performance. Could be sales, could be expenses, profits, cash flow, could be production, how many units of whatever you're producing you produce, if you're really a manufacturing company, product quality, personal turnover, customer satisfaction, inventory, debt. So what's relevant depends on the company, depends on the circumstance, depends on the size, also depends at which level you are. If you are the president of the company, or you're heading a function, or you're the treasurer, or you're running a manufacturing operation, or you're running an HR operation, whether you're in a sales position. These are examples of things you want to know because they're relevant to your company. How much you sell is important to figure out if you're achieving your goals. How much you spend. Usually companies have a budget. You want to make sure that you compare actual with budget. Are you profitable? Are you as profitable as you expected? Are you generating the cash do you need? You need to measure these things. Are you producing as much as you're expected? Is the quality in line with your expectations? Are you having more or less personal turnover that you expected? Is your customer satisfaction reaching the required level? Is your inventory too high or too low? Are you borrowing too much money? And again, all these things, you need to set up first your goals, and then you need to go and measure and compare to see how you're doing. So this is the third bucket of what I call indicators. So as we said, the first thing is to define the indicators, and these slides give you a sense of what they are. So now we need to go to the next step. We need to measure them. How do we measure? Which are the measurement tools that we have? Financial statement is a very key one. Financial statement, usually the profit and loss, the balance sheet, and the cash flow is what reflects how the company is doing. Sales records that, and again, can be sales record by product, by geography, by salesperson, by the type of product, by product line, whatever is appropriate. Accounting audits. Once in a while, most large companies, I would say, contract a third party to look at your accounting and do an audit. Is the accounting being done in accordance with accepted principles? Remember, inside the company, you have people doing this. You need a third party to look at this. Could be a third party inside the company or a third party outside the company. Human resources records is the way you measure, are you taking all the right actions before you hire somebody, before you fire somebody? Is your payroll process working properly? Personnel interactions, as we said before, We have issues of privacy, of sexual harassment, of people management. You wanna make sure that you look at your personnel interactions and ensure that you're living up to all the requirements. Production output, physical inventories, and I said before, you can look at the indicators, and for each of them, you will have a proper set of measurements. Remember what we were discussing before, you cannot measure everything. Usually the information has cost, but whatever your position, whatever the indicator, dig in deep into the subject to define which are the measurement tools that will really give me a good sense of that indicator. The same way, as I said, financial statements will give you a good sense of your revenue, of your cost, and of your profit, of your cash flow. So that's an example of how the process works. You look at the indicator, one indicator you define as very important, critical, and then come up with the measurement tools that will properly reflect what that indicator, the value of that indicator. So now we have the indicator, we have measured them. So the next step is to compare them. We need to compare them with standards. What are the standards? Objectives, plans, projections, expectations. Unfortunately, many times company management said, well, the future is very uncertain. I don't know what I'm gonna do. My objective to sell as much as I can, make as much profit as I can. That is probably a very weak way of managing the company, because unless you have stated goals, you cannot define the resources needed and you cannot deploy the resources needed. So make sure that you have proper standards. Now, could be just a stated objective, and the objective can be, I wanna grow 10% a year, or I wanna sell $1 million, or wanna have a profit of 10% of my sales. Plans. Again, this is a step a little bit more elaborated. You not only have an objective, but you drill into the objective and go further and say, to achieve this objective, I need so many salespeople, I need so much staff, I need to spend so much in marketing, so much in advertising. You might have projections. Maybe they are not as elaborate as a plan, but you project, the next year I'm planning to do this and that. Or it could be just expectations. The important thing is there are different levels of formality, there are different levels of sophistication, there are different levels of detail. The key message here, make sure you have goals, and that measurable goals, and they're put in writing, and call it objectives, plans, projection, expectations, or whatever other name you feel comfortable with. But make sure that for all the key variables of your company, you preset standards against which you're gonna measure the results and determine if your company is doing as you wanted it to do or not. Again, key thing here is to quantify. You need numbers to measure and to quantify. So going back, we set the indicators, we measure them, we're comparing them, and now we find if there are deviations. So let's go to the next step, that is deviation, how we analyze the source of deviations. And I'm here also suggesting two big buckets. One is a system problem or an operations problem. A system problem is a systemic issue where the structure or the process or the culture or the way we operate generates a problem that's repetitive, comes over and over again, and unless we tackle the system issue, will keep coming up. Operations problem is something more circumstantial. Maybe the system is not the problem, but either we made a wrong decision or we did not make a decision at the proper time, or something happened that was unexpected, or somebody didn't follow directions and the problem came up. So conceptually, it's very important to define if the deviation is due to an problem inherent in the systems and processes we use, or it's a circumstantial issue got created by operations. So just an example of a systemic problem, realistic objectives. If we come up with totally unrealistic objectives consistently, then we'll find out that we always have big deviations. And the issue is that we're setting a goal that is unachievable for the resources we have. That is a problem. The goal needs to be a stretch, need to be challenging, but has to be achievable. Appropriate strategy. This is something that pops up very frequently. The business needs to have a defined strategy. And we don't have the defined strategy, very likely we will not get where we want to go. And the strategy encompasses the products, the market, the people. It's very comprehensive, and depending on the circumstances, you can drill into something in particular, but strategy is basically direction. Does the company know where it wants to go? And it's structured and aligned to get where you want to go. That's the appropriate strategy. Resource allocation. If we don't allocate resources to the people in particular who needs to achieve certain goals, the thing is not going to work. So if we consistently misallocate resources, either by giving too much or giving too little, that is an issue that will always generate deviations. And we need to understand if there's an embedded problem or poor resource allocation or lack of a resource allocation problem, lack the allocation process. Infrastructure capacity. An example, if we want to produce a certain quantity of product, but we don't have the manufacturing capacity to do it, that will never happen. So we need to be consistent and make sure that whatever goal we set that has to do with an infrastructure need, the infrastructure is there to do it. And could it be building, could be machinery, could be equipment, could be tools, whatever it is, the infrastructure availability should be aligned with the objectives. Organization alignment, something very often ignored and very crucial. Organization alignment means that people's objectives are aligned with the organization objective. If we have different functions, different individuals whose goals are not directed to the common objective of the company is in trouble. And that is a systemic problem. We need to make sure that the organization alignment, to a great extent driven by compensation, incentives, is aligned so everybody is pushing in the same direction, and we don't have different areas of the company pushing in different directions and then making an issue of achieving the overall goal. Communication. Sometimes companies have problems communicating properly, making sure that the right communication gets to the right individuals at the right time. Most companies have the sin of not enough communication or not clear communication or not timely communication. This is, again, another example of systemic problem. And there are many more like this. This is just an example of situations where an issue with the system, with an approach, creates a repetitive deviation from objectives. And then we have what I call here operations problem. Management direction. Management might be given the wrong direction on a specific issue. If that direction is followed, but the direction was wrong, that will create a problem and hence a deviation. We might have enough material, or the cost of the material came out to be higher than we expected. Maybe there was a strike, or there was a virus, or there was a lack of transportation, or whatever it was that generated a problem is a circumstantial problem, but that could be the cause of the deviation. Available headcount. Sometimes we cannot hire enough people, or we cannot train enough people, or we don't have enough capable people as we need to perform the job. That is probably not necessarily related to a system, might be a circumstance at any particular time. Personnel capabilities and costs. Again, as I said before, we don't have the people with the proper skills, the proper training, and the salaries are in line with what we expected. We'll have a deviation that has to be corrected. Equipment functioning or malfunctioning might be a circumstance where it's not a system issue, but we had a maintenance problem that is not a systemic maintenance problem, but something went up, or the power was cut off, or we had a fire in the building or something like that. That equipment function, that might be the reason for the deviation. Information flow, if that has to do with communications. If the information is not flowing to the right people at the right time, in the right quantities, and it's correct, then that generates an operations problem. So these are examples of operations problems that generate deviations. So again, just to make sure we understand, this is what we look at when we're trying to understand the source of deviations. We define the key elements to measure, we measure them, we compare with our standards, and now we find there's a deviation. It's very important to determine what was the reason for that deviation, because otherwise we cannot take corrective action. And corrective action is the last chapter here. We said before in the process, determine the goals, measure, compare, identify deviations, and take corrective actions to do away with those deviations to the best of your capacity. So some potential corrective actions. Organization. Maybe we don't have the right structure, we don't have the right individuals, maybe the organization is too centralized or too decentralized, or maybe it's too rigid, or maybe it's too flexible, or maybe we don't have the proper individuals to perform the job. So lack of proper organization structure, lack of proper individuals in the proper positions could be one of the actions to be taken to correct the deviation. As I said before, we might not have the proper strategy. Revising the strategy and making sure that the strategy will take us where we want to go, it's very crucial. And strategies, I always say this, not only important in terms of what we want to do, but also in terms of what we do not want to do. Companies cannot do everything, so strategy defines clearly what the company is trying to do versus what it's not trying to do. Management direction, if we're giving the wrong direction to the organization, we cannot expect to get the right results. So management is to be introspective in this regard and be autocritical of its own actions to define if there's some mistakes made. Company culture, sometimes the culture goes against the company, goes against the individuals. We talk about personal relationships and other characteristics of behavior that has a lot to do with culture. In terms of, could be dedication, in terms of ethics, in terms of care for customers. Companies over time build a culture. And if that culture is not in line with the goals of the company, we have a clash and the company gets in trouble. We might have the wrong pricing, our price is too high, our price is too low. We need to revisit that because maybe our sales are too low, our profits are not enough. Are we sourcing from the proper countries? We have options. Are we sourcing with the proper frequency? Are we using the right transportation? Are we paying the right prices? These are some examples. Transactions, terms and conditions. When we have a contract or when we sign an agreement with a vendor, we have the proper terms and conditions. Or when we sell, are we giving proper terms to our customers? Are we waiting too long to collect? Are we getting enough terms from our vendors in terms of when to pay? Those are just examples. We have bidding process to make sure that we buy at the best price and the best product. Headcount, we have the proper headcount. We have enough resources to achieve what we want, or do we have too many resources that is burdening our expenses? We need to look at that again and say, we need corrective actions here. Are we paying the right salaries? Are we having such high turnover? And maybe it's because we're not paying the market salaries, or maybe our salaries are too high, but nobody's leaving, but have a very expensive cost base. Maybe I should be selective and pay more to certain specific functions, to certain specific individuals. Is the behavior of the company proper? Are we allowing people to bring up problems? So we have a behavior that indicates, I don't want to hear any bad news, don't tell me about it. And that creates an issue that very often happens in companies where the problems are not brought to management attention early enough. And in this regard, a proper tone from the top, as it is called, it's crucial. It's not just what the company says, it's the way the management team behaves. And we talk about internal processes. Maybe some of the processes are not right. Maybe we need to review the way we control cash, or the way we do bidding, or the way we define vendors, or the way we buy equipment, or many other things, or the way we hire people. So these are just examples of corrective actions that go to the heart of the deviations. The list will depend on the circumstances and the company. These are examples, but the process doesn't change. Set your goals, determine the proper measures to measure your goals, determine the standards and compare them with the actual results, identify the cause for the deviations, and then take corrective actions to do away with those deviations. So that's a summary of the presentation. Let me finish with one last slide on key takeaways. You control to identify problems on a timely basis. That's the purpose of control. Get to the problem before the problem gets to you. Identify problems on a timely basis so you can take corrective actions and avoid the problem to becoming bigger and bigger. Tone at the top. Management needs to show with example. It's not just what management says, but management needs to evidence with action. If internal processes are important, if culture is important, if behavior is important, all that needs to be communicated from the top, not only in written communications, but also in verbal communications and the way company executives behave. Need to be aware of external regulations. That's not always put in front of the eyes of management. Sometimes you need to do some digging and some research, but be aware that wherever activity you're in, there's some regulation that apply to you. It might be at the federal level, at the state level, at the county level, at the city level, or maybe all of the above. Find out what they are before you find yourself you're not in compliance. Develop robust internal processes. You wanna make sure that the way your company operates internally is in line with what you wanna do, the way you do the accounting, the way you take care of your money, the way you hire, the way you fire, the way you develop performance appraisals. You need to have processes for all that, and they need to be robust. People need to understand them. People need to follow them. Define objectives and associated performance indicators. I emphasize this one more time. You need to have clear goals, and those goals need to be translated into measure indicators. And I said before, could be sales, could be profit, could be revenue. If you're in a factory, it could be the production of, if you're depending on the hours of uptime, could be different things for different circumstances, different positions, but make sure they're always clear objectives and they are measurable. You need to put the information in place to measure compliance. As we said before, if you don't have the information, you cannot measure. And information requires work, sometimes require effort, sometimes require resources. But if you don't deploy the information in the proper way, first, people don't get the communication they need, and second, management doesn't get the feedback in terms of what the actual results are. Analyze deviations. That could be a very rich process. Don't ignore the deviations or attribute deviation to think that you have nothing to do about. Dig into them, determine, again, if they are systemic, if they are operational, if they are maybe due for things that are outside your control, and that could also well be the case. And then the deployment of corrective actions. For each deviation, try to think through what actions can I take, what can I manage, what is controllable by the company, what can I do to make sure that the next cycle, at least those deviations I had won't be there, or if they are there, will be less, and if someone new deviation comes up, we'll face it. But this is an ongoing, constant improvement process where to deploying corrective action, we take care of deviations, and hopefully over time, we're gonna get our actual indicator closer and closer to our goals. So let me finish here and open up if there are any questions about this very rich subject. And I said before, we're just touching the surface of this, but the purpose here of this webinar was to give you an overall picture of what control is, why do we need it, how do we apply it, and the relevance of making sure you give it proper consideration as you manage your company.
Thank you, Ricardo. I noticed we don't have any questions in the chat or the Q&A. I'm going to ask a couple questions to you, Ricardo, and then that'll give folks some time to maybe come up with some additional questions. So really good information, really good content. So if somebody was really taking this to heart to their business, what is one or two things that they can do like today or tomorrow to kind of get moving on enacting some of the recommendations you made from the presentation?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I would emphasize some of the things I mentioned here. Make sure you have well-established goals, measurable goals, and make sure you measure the results and compare them with the goals. That's probably the most important thing. Once you have stated goals and you can measure your results, then you can define why am I off and what can I do to fix it.
Based on your work that you've done, Ricardo, kind of what is the most common issue with management controls? What's the most common issue you see among the businesses you work with? When folks say, hey, I need help getting a handle on this, what's the most common issue that you see?
Yeah, the most common issue I see really is the lack of measurement. This happens very often with financial information for small businesses. Many small businesses lack the proper financial statements, or the management or the owner doesn't pay attention to the financial statements. So the management doesn't really know, are my sales what I expected? Are my profit what I expected? And let alone the possibility of analyzed deviation. So developing measurement systems for the key variables is something that unfortunately it's missing very often in many of the small and medium-sized businesses we consult with.
Yeah. And I think the biggest issue you raised, Ricardo, was that people don't really worry about this while things are going well. It's always when something goes wrong that people start trying to look into it. And a lot of times it's a lot more work or it's a lot more difficult. So I think that was a good point that you made in terms of kind of like looking at things early and kind of doing an assessment and things like that.
That's right.
Okay, so I think Sharon had a question in the chat. She said one of the issues here with small businesses is that they think they are not required as they're too small. What advice would you give them in regards to the importance of management controls?
As you said, Brian, businesses are too small until a control issue comes up and the control issue takes over. There are key things in particular as it relates to external regulations that can be extremely damaging for the business. And as I mentioned also before, it's not necessarily explicit what those regulations are, but whatever is your business, you need to do the work and find out which are the key external regulations I need to comply with. Because if not, said before, one day you can get hit with something totally unexpected that could really wipe out your business. That, as I indicated, as it relates to the outside world. And the inside world, again, set your goals, measure your results, and compare them.
Okay. I don't see any other questions or comments. I don't see anything else, so I think it's pretty thorough, Ricardo. I think you covered a lot of ground on it. If you guys do think of a question, if you have any need for follow-up information, as Brianna noted, she will be sending you a copy of the PowerPoint slides, as well as the link to the web video of this web recording. But if you do have any questions that come up afterwards, feel free to email Brianna and she can get you connected with Ricardo. Because I know a lot of times then something will come up and you'd wish you'd ask a question during the webinar. So I just want to thank Ricardo for his presentation. I want to thank Brianna for kind of helping organize everything. And I want to thank you guys for participating. Great turnout. Please don't forget to fill out the survey. Brianna did just post it. Oh, so we did get a couple more questions. So, okay, so fill out the survey and then I'm going to get to the other questions. Is there a resource that you would recommend to identify government regulations apply to different types of businesses?
Well, usually there are the areas where you can get, there are organizations that can help you in that regard. We have here in Miami, the Beacon Council is one of them. But if not, you need to go to the website of either the city or the state and determine, sometimes you might have licensing requirements, and other times could be some federal law. But along the lines that I mentioned, once you start bringing in employees, you need to be aware of the labor regulations. If you're in a kind of business that might have environmental implications, you need to dig into the environmental issues. And there are certain basic things in terms of, let's say, ethics and in terms of accounting that you need to be followed. So if you personally are not familiar with that, you need either to bring people on your staff that can help you on this. Try to find organizations in the community that might help you in that regard. And the other thing, go to the website that are very rich in information.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, as Ricardo noted, you're going to have to, depending on your industry and depending on where you're located, you're generally going to have, you know, federal regulations to pay attention to, state regulations, county regulations and also potentially city regulations. So, you know, you have different aspects. As Ricardo mentioned, the Beacon Council, there's also, based on your industry, different industry specific associations. So you can actually go to the website. If it's a restaurant association, if it's manufacturing, if it's international trade related, those type of things, there are specific industry associations. And I would say they have the best handle on different regulations, different things, because it actually does change from year to year, you know, depending on what comes up. So I'd say definitely check into that. Also, if you have any tax accountant folks or attorneys and things like that, those are also sometimes folks that can apply, you know, tell what regulations apply to you. We also did get a question, Ricardo, from Noreen, who was asked, she thanked you for your wonderful presentation. She said, in terms of performance management and measurement, strategic planning and operations tie back to organization development and building upon that. How do we incorporate design thinking and agile adaptability in today's world?
Okay, that's a very good question. It's an ongoing issue, and that's part, I would say, of the management efficiency. In particular with small companies, you should be very fast in adapt or you will not survive. Right? I think what we had here with this COVID crisis is a good example. There are some industries, we can talk about restaurants that overnight had to switch from indoor dining to pickup and delivery. But that happens all the time. The industry around you is changing. The type of business you're in might be changing. The competitors are changing. This is part of your, should be part of your day-to-day job. As you set your strategy, you need to get a reading of the environment. And then you say, well, this is the strategy I have. Do I need to adapt? Do I need to change? Do you need to move it? I will also add that our consultant SPDC can very well equipped to help in that regard, and we have a different consultant with different specialties, but across all of us, I mean, this concept of making sure you are consistent with your business goals and you're responsive to the environment and the changes in circumstances is always at the top of the list. So there's not a formula, just the relevance of keeping that in mind and keep questioning your strategy to make sure that it doesn't lag the reality around you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so cool. I don't see any additional questions, Ricardo. So I just want to thank you again for your presentation. Great feedback from all the participants. And just want to thank everybody for attending. And if we can help you in any way, feel free to follow up. Thanks again. Have a great week.